Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so let's just get into this new chapter, Repetition for Itself. This video I've broken up into 4 parts: repetition, habit, the self, and then fatigue and need. This video took so much effort rewriting and just thinking about these ideas. I think that I've got it pretty sorted, kind of, maybe, for myself anyway. We'll see how we go with this. It's this one's been a real tough one to get done. But anyway, let's start with repetition. So the first thing that Deleuze talks about here is repetition in the object. There are 2 kinds of repetition: repetition in the object, repetition in the subject. We'll start with repetition in the object. This is a passive synthesis, which means that it's not reflective, non-reflective. So prior to all memory and reflection. And that's really important to keep in mind. This is before any kind of intellectual activity at all. So passive synthesis, non-reflective. The operative force in this, in repetition in the object, is imagination. But we have to be careful with that word, because obviously when we normally think of imagination, we imagine, or we think of a conscious being, thinking, doing something intellectual. But obviously that's not what Deleuze can possibly be meaning here, because this is prior to all kinds of what we would normally call intellectual activity. So what does he mean by imagination? Basically, he just means a contractile power, something which serves to bring a number of things together into a whole, contracting a group of things, a series of things, contracting a number of things into one indivisible whole, a whole which is more than just the sum of a sum of its parts, the sum of its parts. And so this is what this contractile power, imagination, is what affects the synthesis. This whole thing is a passive synthesis. Repetition in the object is a passive synthesis. It's affected by this contractile power, which Deleuze calls imagination. And he talks here about Hume as well. And maybe this is where he gets the idea of imagination from. So for Hume, repetition arises in the way that if we experience an event A, for example, and every time we experience that event A, event B follows it. So when that happens, over the course of enough experiences, A and B become connected. There comes to be what we call a causal relation, right, between these 2 events, A and B. And so that A and B being kind of linked is the contraction here that Deleuze would be talking about, that Deleuze is talking about. And repetition appears as the repetition of each of these contracted cases A, B. So every time we see an A, we expect a B comes along. This is what is, these 2 events are contracted together into one, an A-B event, and every time that happens again, that's another repetition. So that's how repetition appears in Hume. He also talks about Bergson, where something very similar happens. Contraction is, in this case, though, a gathering together of individual events, or a succession of individual moments or events. So the contraction is taking a number of these individual events and, again, grouping them together as a whole. So we don't see the individual events themselves, we see the whole, the package that is all of these events. Whole is a better word because it carries the idea that it's not a collection of parts anymore. It's a whole, which is something different from the parts that make it up. So that's what the contraction is, and the repetition is the repetition of each of these elements within the whole that get grouped together, that get contracted into this whole. So you've got these two different but similar ways of thinking about repetition here. Hume repetition of two cases which are fused together, an A-B, or two events, I should say, which are fused together into a single case, an A-B, and that A-B gets repeated. And in Bergson, the repetition is the repetition of the individual events themselves, which get contracted into a whole. And the problem with this for Deleuze is that both of these tether repetition and therefore passive synthesis to senses, to the senses or to perception, to something, someone, some agent, some subject which is enacting the synthesis, the contraction. So there's what we have with Hume and Bergson is we in order to have the repetition, we must have a subject already. And what Deleuze is trying to do is get behind that to see how the subject arises from repetition to begin with. So for Deleuze, perceptual syntheses refer back to organic syntheses, which are like the sensibility of the senses. They refer back to a primary sensibility that we are. We are made of contracted water, earth, light, and air, not merely prior to the recognition or representation of these, but prior to their being sensed. Okay, so this is now we see an important metaphysical claim that's being made. We're going past the sensing. We're going deeper than sensing, perception, to this, what I would describe as a primordial metaphysical tendency. And I think that maybe that's I like that word tendency here, because it keeps us away from thinking of some kind of a force or a willing or a desire or even the word consciousness might want to creep in here. Keeps us away from those kinds of words which inevitably lead to a kind of reification of some sort, a metaphysical reification of whatever it is that we're talking about. We want to steer clear of that kind of thing. So this Deleuze is referring to a primordial metaphysical tendency, I think. So beyond the perceptual syntheses which Hume and Bergson are both talking about, we're going to this organic syntheses. I like that word, organic syntheses, which are like the sensibility of the senses. So, I get the sensibility of the agent, the subject doing the sensing. We're going past that to the very senses themselves. What is their sensibility? Now that's what we're discussing with Deleuze. And this is this primary sensibility that we are. And that's a really crucial part of this quote, because we're describing how the subject itself arises, how the subject is constituted itself, not what the subject does, not what the subject constitutes through, say, an act of perception. Now we're looking at the subject itself, how it arises, what it is. And it is contracted water, earth, light, air. It's all of these elements contracted together into this whole which is the organism, or even the parts of the organism. Deleuze will talk about this, and we will as well. The heart, the muscles, all of these parts are all contractions in this Deleuzian sense. They're all passive syntheses, and they make up the very being of the subject. So when we have Bergson and Hume talking about a series of events being taken together, that's their contraction. For them, contraction is an action by a subject on a series of events. For Deleuze, contraction is what allows there to be a subject in the first place. And we'll revisit this idea in a bit more detail when we come to habit later. So that's contraction. Each contraction, Deleuze says, is a sign referring to other contractions, and he calls these natural signs. So remember, the word sign is important for Deleuze. It comes up again and again, and it's to be understood in that very lived sense of the word. So it's not an intellectual reference to something else. It's not a sign that's indicating a referent. It's a sign that's inviting action, that's calling to be taken up for something. And I think a good way to always take us back to that video where we talked about the swimmer learning to swim, and the way that signs were involved in that process of learning. Same kind of thing. That's what these signs are. They are, for want of a better word, they're lived signs, not intellectual signs. And so all of these contractions they function as signs for each other, in which different parts of the organism are questioning, interrogating, responding, answering. There's just this interplay of activity, of signs and responses going on. And it's kind of a nice picture, I think, right? If you think about an organism, it's not a static thing. It's this interplay of activity. And so a sign, thinking of signs is a nice way to talk about this. And these are, just remember, natural signs. Another thing about this passive synthesis, repetition in the object, this also constitutes time as a living present, and the past and the future as Deleuze says dimensions, but I think maybe a better word here, just to avoid confusion, is extensions of this present. So the passive synthesis constitutes time as a living present. Okay, it's worth taking the time to think about this a little bit. So it's not a dimension. We can't think of time here as a dimension. It's not something that exists independently of these passive syntheses, which are taking place in the object through that repetition, through that contraction. That is what time is. That is what the present is. And that's really important to grasp here. If we think of time as a dimension, or as some kind of manifold in which we are moving through, or whatever, we're going to come completely unstuck. And this is where I think a deeper understanding of Bergson really helps, because he has a very unique, I think, approach to time, which is very unpopular these days in our scientific age, where time, space have become merged and operate as independent dimensions, a priori metaphysical facts or truths about the world, independent of any kind of subjects within the world itself. And that's the exact opposite of what we're talking about here. The passive syntheses give rise to time as a living present. And a consequence of this, which I think I've been dancing around a little bit so far up till now, is that time doesn't exist in the natural world as such. It doesn't exist in the universe until you have some kind of organic life, until there's something which is capable of this passive synthesis, which brings this passive synthesis about. Because until you have that contraction, which brings about this lived present, there is no present. There's no sense in which we can talk about time at all. And that's a really, like I said, a really counterintuitive idea for most people, and one that almost rules it out, because straight away you think, so time's subjective? It's all in your head? No, it's not all in your head. This is prior to memory, prior to reflection, prior to intellectual, cognitive activity. But it isn't out there in the world. It's a function of this passive synthesis. And yeah, that's a really crucial idea to get a hold of. And it's, like I said, one of the reasons why a full engagement with Bergson is really helpful here. So yeah, time is localized, but that doesn't mean it's we each have kind of our own separate times. Again, even that doesn't make any sense, right? It's just that the sense of the present arises through these passive syntheses, and we all, as in all human beings, have the same sense. Our presence are kind of aligned because we're all the same kind of species. We're all the same kind of being. We all perceive in similar ways. We all sense in similar ways. We're all constructed through similar acts of passive syntheses. And so our lived presence coincide because of that correlation, because of that, because of the same way that we're all constituted. We're all constituted through these similar acts of passive syntheses. There's a similar contraction going on within us, which makes us. And so that the time that comes out, but yeah, there is no universal time. That's kind of the bottom line here. There's no universal time which we're all participating in or moving through. That reifies time. It makes it something separate from us, gives it some independent existence, and that is exactly what Deleuze is not saying. So that's the lived present. And the past and the future emerge as extensions of this present. So they don't have, we're not talking about an actual past and an actual future as we normally think of them here. The past and the future at this stage in the passive synthesis are connected to that lived present. So the past then in the passive synthesis is the immediate past of retention, and the future, the immediate future of anticipation. And so if you've read any Husserl, you'll recognize that straight away, and it's basically the same idea. It is the same idea, retentions. Husserl calls them protensions, but they're all extensions of this fundamental lived present. And so that's time. That's how time arises in the passive synthesis, connected to this lived present. We'll talk more about that when we get to habit as well. And then the rest of this, we go into massive details on probably the next video and maybe the video after that on time as well. And just an interesting point to note, I think, connecting this to something real is the way that this arises in the organism. So when we think of an organism, we can think of, in terms of this passive synthesis, we can think of an organism as a sum of contractions, of retentions and expectations. And that really just drives home the point that these passive syntheses make up the organism itself. It's not that there is an organism which is then enacting these passive syntheses. The passive syntheses constitute the organism. They make up the very thing that it is. And the retained past appears in the organism through cellular heredity, and the expected future arises in need, which we'll talk about later. But that's just kind of one way to think about the organism, or the way that we think about the organism through this lens of the passive syntheses. And I'll try and connect that to the active syntheses right now, because we're going to look at repetition in the subject. So that was passive syntheses, repetition in the object. Repetition in the subject is an active synthesis as opposed to the passive. And the operative forces here, remember, for repetition in the object, the operative force was imagination. The operative forces here in the active syntheses, memory and intelligence. So understanding. So now we are into this, what we could call reflection. Now we're on the reflective side. And these active syntheses are grounded in the passive synthesis, or in the passive syntheses, as it takes them up and acts upon the signs constituted therein. So the passive syntheses, that's the foundational, that's that nice expression, the organic syntheses. That's what constitutes the organism. And then the active syntheses, they're built on top of it. The fundamental structure comes from the passive syntheses. But there are also, so that they're grounded in the passive syntheses, takes up the signs which we talked about there, the individual contractions within the passive syntheses. But there are also signs in the active synthesis, and Deleuze calls these artificial signs. And that's because they're not as fundamental, they're not as natural, they're not as maybe organic. That's just trying to get the idea that they are built on top. They're a secondary structure erected on top of this more originary foundation. Hence the fact that signs that arise here at this level are artificial. Not in a negative sense, I don't think, but just to distinguish them from the more the primary syntheses, primary contraction, primary signs from the passive synthesis. And the way that so we talked about the organism viewed through the lens of the passive synthesis, some of contractions, some of retentions and expectations. Retained past appears in cellular heredity. Expected future appears in need. Well, through the lens of the active synthesis, what we see when we think of an organism, instead of cellular heredity and this kind of need of the passive synthesis, we see instinct and learning. So memory and intelligence, we understand the organism in terms of memory and intelligence, which appear through instinct and through learning. And that's just kind of a way to, it's almost like different levels of the organism. You've got that primary level, the organic syntheses, and then the passive synthesis, and then you come up to the secondary level where the active syntheses take over, and here the organism is understood in terms of memory, intelligence, which arises through instinct and learning. Okay, enough of that. So just to finish this section then, there are 3 instances of repetition. So these 2 kinds of repetition in the object, repetition in the subject, they give us 3 instances of repetition, what Deleuze calls instances. The first is the in itself, which causes the repetition to disappear as it appears, leaving it unthinkable. So the in itself here is basically the result, if you like, of the synthesis, or the thing produced by it. For example, the causal connection between A and B in Hume, or perception in Bergson, or the organism in Deleuze, or the memory, the thought, with regards to the active syntheses. But that thing, the result of the syntheses, that's what Deleuze is calling the in itself here, and that causes the repetition, which brings it about, those acts of contracting, which bring it about. It causes those to, or it kind of overrides them. It replaces them with itself. So when we think about what's happening, we don't see the repetition underneath it. We don't see the repetition that gave rise to it, which is these syntheses. And that's why Deleuze will say repetition has been overlooked, because when we reflect on ourselves or on our intellectual activity, we don't see we don't see the genesis behind it. All we see is the result, and that leads us into false conclusions. So that's the first instance, the in itself of repetition. Then we have the second instance, the for itself of the passive synthesis. And so this is for itself because basically the elements are contracting themselves. There's no subject doing the contracting, remember. Passive syntheses contract themselves. They fuse together to create, to bring about the subject. So Deleuze calls this the for itself. And then the third instance is the reflected representation of a for us in the active synthesis or syntheses. And so this is a reflected representation for us. It occurs for a subject. So we're at the level where there is a subject doing something, enacting the syntheses. So you got those 3 instances of repetition which arise out of the 2 kinds of repetition in the object, repetition in the subject. The 3 instances, the in itself, which is the thing itself that repetition produces, the for itself of the passive synthesis, and the for us of the active syntheses. Nice. So that's repetition. Let's turn to have a look at habit. So habit is a contraction, basically, in that Deleuzian sense of the word. And it's essential to both passive and active syntheses. And the thing about this habit is that it draws difference from the repetition that we've identified already in those 2 syntheses. We haven't talked that much about the repetition, actually, in the subject. But the repetition comes about through the signs which are repeated, through the contractions. Again, the contractions which the active syntheses take up and do something with, which brings about memory and intelligence. And we'll talk about those a little bit later as well, so don't worry too much about that just yet. But okay, habit draws difference from the repetitions in those two syntheses. There are two types of habit. The first is sensory motor, and this is psychological and concerns the active syntheses. And again, we're going to brush over that for now and revisit this later. And the other type is the primary, what Deleuze calls the primary habit. And this is our habit of living. Again, we're back to that idea, thinking in terms of these passive syntheses that constitute the subject itself. So we're going right back to prior to there being a subject, prior to there being any kind of sensing, any kind of perceiving. We're looking to understand how it is that the subject which will perceive, which will sense, how that subject comes to be. And that's in this passive synthesis and this primary habit, which is a reference to the contraction that the passive syntheses enacts. Passive syntheses is, even, we could say. So the primary habit, our habit of living, and this is an interesting quote. He calls this the thousands of passive syntheses of which we are organically composed. It's a nice expression just to keep us on track, that this is what we're talking about. How we are constituted. What we are. What makes us. What constitutes us. So the primary habit works through another word that Deleuze throws in here, contemplation. And this is very kind of analogous to what we talked about with imagination before, when we were looking at just kind of the bare repetition in the object and the contracting forth, that contractile power. We talked about imagination being the operative force. Well, he introduces this new word contemplation here, but it has the same kind of connotations. Contemplation is the contracting force behind the habit. And yeah, he even uses the words together in some places in the book. I remember one passage in particular. He brings them. He talks about them in exactly the same context. So I think we're fine to think about contemplation and imagination as basically the same kind of thing. Perhaps imagination is less tied to a specific instance, a specific organism, or a specific organ, part of an organism. But so maybe there's a sense of a kind of general kind of connotation to imagination. Contemplation is more focused on a specific case. Perhaps you could gloss it like that. But like I say, basically the same thing. So contemplation, it's not thinking, it's not reflection, it's not an act of mind. Definitely not. And he describes this, and this is what I mentioned in the last section. He describes this as a fusion, and it's a really good way to think about this. To get what Deleuze means when he says contraction. Habit is a contraction, but we want to understand what he's getting at when he says we're contracting things. And he gives a good example. When we think of contraction, we usually think of, the example he gives is the heart, but we think of something which contracts, squeezes, and then dilates. And again, there's a contraction, expansion, contraction, dilation. So he says this refers to a tick which is balanced by a tock, tick-tock. That's how we usually think of contraction, as one of a pairing that go together, an in and an out, a contraction and a dilation. But contraction also refers to the fusion of successive tick-tocks in a contemplative soul. When we say that habit is a contraction, we are speaking not of an instantaneous action which combines with another to form an element of repetition, but rather of the fusion of that repetition in the contemplating mind. A soul must be attributed to the heart, to the muscles, nerves, and cells. So a lot to think about in that passage. The first thing then is that the repetition is not an instantaneous action which combines with another, as it was for Hume and Bergson, where you've got actions, individual actions, which are combined together to form a grouping, a collection, a collective. In Hume, it was a pairing, A and B, and in Bergson, it was it could be, it's indefined how many individual actions are brought together. But anyway, that's how it was for those two. For Deleuze here, contraction is a fusion of the successive tick-tocks into a whole. And I think this is still, however, the Bergsonian sense of the word whole, in which the whole is a whole because it's not a mere sum of its parts. It's different from the parts which make it up. And if we break the whole into its parts, we get something different. We lose the whole. The parts are abstractions. The whole is something different from the collection of its parts. So the contraction, as Deleuze is thinking about it here, is not, like I said before, the action of a subject gathering together a number of individual moments or events. Rather, it's the fusion of a number of moments or events, but into something whole, into something which can then fuse other events or moments into wholes. So I'm just trying to get to this idea that it's more primordial, it's more originary. And that's the difference between, I think, the words contraction, where you think of combining something together, but you think of combining as someone doing the combining, someone doing the contracting, whereas this word fusion perhaps gives us a more organic sense that we get something out of this specific contraction, this fusion of Deleuze's, which is the thing itself, which makes something. It doesn't just become something for someone else. It doesn't become a perception for someone. It doesn't become a sense for a subject. It becomes something itself, something in itself. I think that if I've explained that right, that's how I see the difference here between contraction as fusion for Deleuze and contraction as, what would I say, a gathering together, as it was for Hume and Bergson. And the other thing that's really important about this, which took me ages to, which just kind of hit me last night while I was going through this, what is repeated here is not the elements themselves. Remember that for Hume, what was repeated was the case AB. What was for Bergson, what's repeated is the events themselves as they're collected together. What's repeated for Deleuze, what repetition is it's not the elements themselves, it's not the content, it's the act of contracting. The contraction itself is what's repeated, is what the repetition is. And so that's why he can talk of repetition, which entails, which must be, there has to be an element of similitude here, right? I mean, otherwise it's not even repetition. You can't say something that happens again is the same, or you can't say something that happens again repeats unless it has some kind of connection with the prior instance. But what the connection is for Deleuze, it's not sameness, it's not identity, because we're not talking about the content, we're not talking about the elements themselves. We're talking about the act of contraction. The act of contracting is what's repeated. And that is the same. But it's kind of a formal sameness, if you like. It's not the identity of the specific events or elements themselves. So I think that's a really important point. Repetition is the repetition of the act of contracting, not what is contracted. And that keeps us away from having to say that there's identity within repetition. There is a kind of sameness to a degree, but it's a formal sameness. It's a sameness that doesn't have any content to it. The sameness is in the action, the act of contracting. And so you can have all of these multiple thousands of passive syntheses, thousands of contractions going on within the organism, and they're all different. But they're all repetition, because what's repeating is the act of contraction, the passive syntheses as acts. Anyway, that's a really important point, I think, in this, that we can draw from that passage. Just keeping working. Let's just keep working through that fusion. So he says that the fusion of that repetition in the contemplating mind. Fusion in the contemplating mind. And remember that contemplation is not psychological. It's not active. So we're not talking about idealism here. We're not talking about an actual kind of mind in any sense, in any normal sense of that word. So what is the contemplating mind then? Well, it's the heart, the muscles, the body, the organism, anything that is being constituted through these contractions. So the contractions, the habit, again, constitutes the thing. It constitutes the thing itself. So when Deleuze talks about the contemplating mind, that's what he's talking about. The in itself that arises from these passive syntheses, from these habits of contraction. And then he goes on to say, a soul must be attributed to the heart, to the muscles, nerves, and cells. Do we hear warning bells start ringing here? Kind of, actually. As soon as I really don't like the use of that word soul. It just has too much baggage, and it immediately opens itself to misinterpretation. But the quote continues. A soul must be attributed to the heart, to the muscles, nerves, and cells, but a contemplative soul whose entire function is to contract a habit. This is no mystical or barbarous hypothesis. So, contemplative soul. It's not just a soul. This is not mysticism. It's not religious. It's not superstitious. Because contemplative tells us that it's concerned solely with contraction. Contemplation is just this activity of contraction. And so a contemplative soul then is just, like I said, the thing itself, the heart, the muscles, the organism. I think Deleuze is kind of pushing the line a little bit, pushing the envelope with this, but I think there is still this we're not crossing over into the territory of magic, which for me is just anything that any assertion that doesn't have any kind of core behind it, anything that kind of gestures to some kind of mystical force, or some magical property of the universe or whatever. But it's metaphysics, and there is a world of difference between the two, between magic and metaphysics, between religion and metaphysics, or spirituality and metaphysics. There is all the difference in the world, and Deleuze himself says it, right? It's not mysticism. It's not mysticism. I think we have to take that seriously, despite the language that he's using. He's describing a metaphysical process, not a mystical one. And if he was, I probably wouldn't be doing this video on him, because then it would kind of fall more into the category of religion, where you're invoking some kind of magical power, which has it's just for me. I don't know if it's just the way I imagine it or the way I think about it, but it seems like there's a clear difference for me between a genuine metaphysical claim and one that veers off into rampantly speculative mysticism. And so I'm always trying to thread that needle, and I think Deleuze falls on the right side of that divide. Anyway, that's, and words like, or sentences like that, this is no mystical or barbarous hypothesis. Sentiments like that keep me interested in Deleuze. Okay, so that's habit as contemplation, contraction, and there's also one other thing I want to mention in this section, and that comes from another quote. We do not contemplate ourselves, but we exist only in contemplating. That is to say, in contracting that from which we come. We must always first contemplate something else in order to be filled with an image of ourselves. So this is kind of an interesting, it's a good passage, I think, good quote, because it helps us clarify again what Deleuze is talking about with contemplation. We don't contemplate ourselves because contemplation is the act of contracting. It's that fusion. And we are that contraction. Therefore, contemplation takes place before there is an us, before there is a me to do anything. So it's just another way of keeping this distinction between or preventing us from going down a mystical, spiritual kind of path. Yeah, everything's contemplation. The universe is contemplating. That's taking contemplation in the wrong way. Contemplation happens before there is a subject to do any kind of reflective contemplation. We're not talking about an intellectual activity here. Contemplation is just this contraction, this fusion of elements which constitutes things, which constitutes the organic, which constitutes the heart, the muscles, the body, the organism itself. And these are all just different levels, And you've got the level of the organs. You've got the level of the body itself. You've got the level of the organism itself. These are all just different levels of contraction, levels of contemplation, and they all take place without any contemplator, without any kind of. So again, we totally moving away from any kind of spiritualist kind of religious, pseudo-religious type interpretation of Deleuze. So we exist in contemplating, just going back to the quote, we exist in contemplating. We exist in contemplating, again, because we are that contemplation. We are that contraction. And so in contemplating something not us, because there is no us, we can then be filled with an image of ourselves, because through the contemplation we exist as the thing that we are. We exist as the organism that we are. And that means that we can then reflect on ourselves and be filled with an image of ourselves. That's what Deleuze is getting at there, I think. And it's interesting, this quote, because it's kind of like Deleuze's version of Sartre's intentionality, the intentionality of the for itself. Remember, for Sartre, and more so than it was for Husserl, I think, but for Sartre, consciousness is always consciousness of something. And this was the root of his idea that consciousness is nothingness. The for itself is nothingness, because it itself is nothing. It is only what it's only what it's intending. It itself is empty, translucent, hollow. It has no substance itself. And so there's kind of just an interesting parallel here. Obviously quite different, but still, like I said, Deleuze's version, I think, of Sartre's intentionality. There's no thing beyond the contracting, beyond the act of contraction, because there's no entity doing the contracting. The entity which will arise is the contracting. It's the in itself of that contemplative process. And just one last point then, before we leave this topic. Since contemplation never appears in acts, and I've already mentioned this before actually, but since contemplation never appears in acts because it comprises them, because it's before them, we miss the repetition. Again, back to this idea, we don't see the repetition. That's why Deleuze is saying he's bringing something new to the table here, because it's been missed. We've overlooked the element of repetition here, because in metaphysics, because the contemplation that he's talking about, the repetition, the passive syntheses, they're covered over by the in itself which arises from them, which they produce. We miss then this repetition or the synthesis of the different contractions, fusions, which constitute the in itself. We miss that because all we see is the exterior, if you like. We don't see the repetitions that go into producing that thing, that in itself. All right, let me knock that one on the head and turn to the next section, which is the self. So the self, this is another word that Deleuze has a very unique take on. The self arises through contemplation. Let me give you the quote and then we'll discuss it. There is a self wherever a furtive contemplation has been established, whenever a contracting machine capable of drawing a difference from repetition functions somewhere. The self does not undergo modifications, it is itself a modification. This term designating precisely the difference drawn. Okay, so the self is not a new metaphysical entity. It's not something new that we have to incorporate into our metaphysical understanding of reality. Rather, it's an event. And that event is the difference drawn from the repetition. That is to say, from that act of contracting. And this is quite nice, right? So the self is not some kind of actual thing. It's just the process, the result of these repetitions, these passive syntheses going on, and it's the difference between them. It's the differences that arise when you consider these individual contractions, these individual contemplations. When you consider those, the differences between them is what produces this self. And perhaps a better way to think of it then is what produces this sense of self, because self sounds very substantial. It sounds like a very substantive idea, and the self is not that. It's not this. There's nothing. There's no nucleus to it, if you like. There's no core to it. It's purely the result of the contemplations, the repetitions, these acts of contracting. And one thing that's really nice about this, that I like about it, is that it actually explains the self. It gives us a genuine explanation of the self, because the self is emerging from something which is not self. And this might sound a little bit Buddhist-y in terms, and it kind of is, but as I've said countless times before, I think Buddhism takes this idea, which is a good idea, but draws all of the wrong conclusions from it. What I like about this idea of self arising from as like the difference between these contractions, is that, and so therefore arising from something which is not self, is that you cannot explain a thing by referring to it. So a good example of this, which people just, I don't know, it just seems to elude any of the discussions on consciousness that are taking place these days. You can't explain consciousness by referring to conscious things. So panpsychism is it's dead in the water from the start, because it just says everything is conscious, even if it's just a little bit. But if you're saying that everything is conscious, you're not explaining consciousness. By definition, you're invoking consciousness as part of your metaphysical picture. You're presupposing it. You're just throwing consciousness into the foundations of reality. But that's not explaining it. You haven't explained what consciousness is, how it arises. There's no mechanism on offer there. Same with idealism. You can't say everything is conscious or everything is consciousness and think you've explained consciousness, because, well, you just said everything is consciousness. You've just blown consciousness up to the size of the universe, but that doesn't tell us anything about it. It doesn't explain it. It doesn't give us a mechanism for it. It just says it's always been there, and it always will be there, apparently. And it's the same with this. You can't explain the self by reference to something which has selfness, which has a core of identity, because that characterizes the self, right? This sense of being who we are. But you can't explain that by appealing to identity. Something has to produce that identity. And that's the beauty of this idea of difference and repetition, because it's that which gives us a mechanism for understanding the identity of the self, the way that the self appears as something fixed, something which is identical with itself. Deleuze gives us here an explanation, because what makes that self is not itself a self. And you've got to have that. So I like that. Again, the ties to Buddhist thought are there, but as with all religions, I think the kernel of truth gets buried, gets lost with the more speculative, shall we say, metaphysical framework that inevitably comes along with it. And the other thing that's important to just keep in mind with that, there's a self wherever a furtive contemplation has been established. Obviously, again, contemplation is not thinking. It's not a reflective activity. There is no leap from this to any kind of God as nature or anything like that, because the contemplation we're talking about is just not that kind of contemplation. It doesn't get you any of those spiritual rewards that mysticism or spiritualist kind of ideas are looking for. There's no salvation at the end of this path here. So Deleuze sees then, underneath this single self, which is the self that I am, that you are, he sees underneath the self a myriad of little selves. Underneath the self which acts are little selves which contemplate and which render possible both the action and the active subject. We speak of ourself only in virtue of these thousands of little witnesses which contemplate within us. It is always a third party who says me. What organism is not made of elements and cases of repetition, of contemplated and contracted water, nitrogen, carbon, chlorides and sulfates, thereby intertwining all the habits of which it is composed. Brilliant little quote, that one. Again, understood in the right way. We don't want to take this into the obvious kind of spiritual spin-offs, but we want to keep it tied to philosophy. So underneath the self, we're talking about all of those little selves, which are nothing more than the differences from those different contractions, which make up the organism, which I identify with as myself. It's just a really nice, organic, dynamic kind of picture, I think, that Deleuze is giving us. And yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything else to say about that. Underneath the self which acts are little selves which contemplate and render possible both the action and the active subject. Yeah, those little selves which render possible both the action and the active subject, that's all of those passive syntheses that we talked about before. It's all of those acts of contraction which produce the innate selves of the heart, the muscles, the body, and so on. Those different levels that we can pass reality into. There are, however, two ways, I think, to horribly misread this passage. And the first is panpsychism, where it can sound a little bit like Deleuze is talking about selves as little consciousnesses. So we're made, our big consciousness, the consciousness that I am, is made up of all of these little consciousnesses which come together within us, within me. But that's totally not what's going on here, I think. That whole way of thinking, I think, just stems from a poor understanding of consciousness, and what consciousness is. Deleuze calls these cells, a little bit later on, he calls them larval subjects. So there's that sense that they're not fully subjects, but they're not parts of subjects. It's not like we're gluing together little almost subjects, and somehow out of that we get a big subject, understood in terms of consciousness, which is what panpsychism is. And that's the problem that's one of the biggest problems, I think, with panpsychism, apart from the fact that it doesn't explain consciousness at all, is that it's called the combination problem. How do you get one consciousness out of just sticking together a whole bunch of little things which are a little bit conscious? And I think that's an insuperable problem for panpsychism. There is no answer to that, I don't think. So luckily, that's not what Deleuze is doing, because he's not talking about consciousness here. He's not trying to get a singular consciousness out of little semi-conscious parts. The other way to misread this, I think, is vitalism, and this is more tenable. It's a more reasonable interpretation. But for Deleuze, the point is not, so vitalism, everything's alive. Everything's alive in some way. And then when you bring these things which are a little bit alive together, you get one big life. But again, the point is not that everything is alive. Deleuze is not saying everything's living. That just doesn't make sense. It's another bad description, bad definition of life. And it's not what Deleuze is saying. The point is that repetition happens at all levels of reality, at all levels of the world. There's repetition going on. There's these passive syntheses. And repetition, the repetition, remember, of contractions, the repetition of these contractions, and therefore the contractions themselves, or the contemplation also, are fundamental features of the universe, of reality. In other words, they are metaphysical. So what's the point is not that everything's alive. It doesn't fit into anything that Deleuze is saying here to make that claim. The point is that repetition, these passive syntheses, this act of contraction, that is what is like the driver of metaphysical reality. It's at the heart of metaphysical reality. Not everything's alive. You can't even begin to make sense of that in terms of the picture that I've drawn here, I think, with these passive syntheses and with habit and with contraction and contemplation and all of this. It just doesn't make any sense to say this is vitalism. I think it's a horrible misunderstanding of what Deleuze is talking about. But then, isn't there still a kind of combination problem? And I have kind of stumbled into it earlier. I didn't mean to, but the way that Deleuze is talking about all of these larval cells, which is nothing more than the differences drawn from these different acts of repetition, these different contractions. Isn't there still a problem that these larval cells, these little almost selves, maybe you could say, that's not a very good word, these different pre-selves, maybe, larval cells combine into a single self? Don't we still have that problem? Because, okay, so a human being is made up of a myriad of larval subjects. Not larval cells, larval subjects. That's an important distinction, actually. So you've got these larval subjects. They're all this myriad of these little cells combined somehow, and you get one big self as a result of it. Don't we still have this combination problem? And the answer is no, you don't. And the reason why we don't, there are two reasons actually. The first is that, like I said, it's not that we're combining little cells. We're not combining larval subjects. There are no larval subjects to combine. That's thinking about it in the wrong way. That's thinking about it from a substance perspective, from the perspective of being, where the little larval subjects are actual things which we can piece together and then somehow get a total self out of. That's not the picture. The larval selves are just the difference between these different contractions. They don't combine to form a bigger self. The idea that they could is ludicrous, because they're not the kind of thing that can be combined. They're just difference. It's just difference. But it's difference at a different level. And so when we talk about the single self of the organism, of me, for example, me as the self that I know myself to be, this self is a completely different drawing of difference. It's the result of a difference drawn from a completely different set of contractions, contemplations, than the self which arises from, say, the contractions which produce my heart, or which produce my muscles, or which produce my body even. There's these different operations are taking place on completely different levels. There's no way to combine them in any way. There's no similitude between them. One way to think about this, I think, is quite helpful, is to imagine a dot, and then imagine that a circle surrounds that dot, and that circle then encompasses the dot. It is the dot itself. That's what the circle is. It's just this dot. The circle is not an actual line. The circle is just, it's all that it comprises is this dot. And so you've got the dot, you've got the circle, and then you get another circle drawn around that first circle. And this second circle comprises the inner circle and the dot. So what the second circle is, what it is just the inner circle and the dot. And then you get a square drawn around the whole lot. And what that square is the external circle, the inner circle, and the dot. And that's all it is. But what we're not doing when I say the square, I'm not saying it's the dot plus the inner circle plus the external circle together, because the square is just taking them all at a single stroke, as it were. It's operating on a completely different plane. There's no sense in which I'm not building the square up from smaller components. The square just is smacked down on the page, and it immediately grasps, comprehends, again, not in an intellectual sense, but it immediately encapsulates, it immediately is those little parts, those smaller selves. So I think that's the way to think about it. It's not I don't know if that clarifies it or not, but it's not, we're not building up the self from little larval subjects. It's a completely different operation. The self that I am is a completely different drawing of difference from a completely different set of contractions from any of the smaller, the little selves, which I'm comprised. So hopefully that makes sense. I think it makes sense to me. I have to say it. It makes sense to me. I hope I'm trying to express what I think, what seems pretty clear to me anyway, but it seems clear to me after hours of dwelling over this stuff. But yeah, hopefully that clarifies something. So the entire purpose of contemplation then is, Deleuze says, to draw something new from repetition, and that something new is difference. It draws difference from repetition, and it draws difference, or the difference inhabits repetition in two ways then. The first is lengthwise. Here the difference then is between the passive and the active repetitions, passive and active syntheses. And it can also inhabit repetition, what Deleuze calls in depth. It inhabits it in depth, which means between contractions within the passive syntheses themselves. So within the passive syntheses, that's in depth way that difference inhabits these repetitions, and between the levels of passive and active syntheses, that's lengthwise. A lengthwise inhabiting of difference in repetition. So what's important about this, and this is another key idea, I think, for the passive synthesis of the present, difference lies between two repetitions. That, I think, is another, if you only take away one or two ideas from this video, that's one that you should take away. Difference lies between two repetitions. But again, remember that the repetition is not of elements in a series. It's not a repetition of events, but it's the act of contracting itself. That's what's being repeated. And this, again, helps us to avoid the mistake of thinking in terms of substance, thinking in terms of being. There is no being at the level of metaphysical reality, as far as Deleuze is concerned. And that brings us to the last subject of today's video, fatigue and need. So primary habit is a passive synthesis, meaning that it yields the present in which the in itself endures. Okay, good. Quote time. Two successive presents may be contemporaneous with a third present, more extended by virtue of the number of instants it contracts. The duration of an organism's present, or of its various presents, will vary according to the natural contractile range of its contemplative souls. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense in light of all of the things that we've talked about so far in this video. But there are a couple of points that we should talk about. Why so many presents? Why is Deleuze talking about successive presents, and he will eventually talk about past presents, present presents. Why are we talking in terms of, why not just past? Why is the past described as a past present here, and not just one, but a number of past presents? And the answer is that remember that in the passive synthesis, there's only the present. So it just lacks the grammar, if you like, the scope to include a past or a future. There's only the present. And so all of everything that we think about here in terms of passive synthesis must be in terms of of the present. So we've got the lived present, or the present present, but we've got the just lived present as well. And then we've got the less recently lived present. And we've got also maybe the about to be lived present. But in terms of the passive synthesis, there's just no capacity for understanding the past present as past itself. It's always, like I said before, like I said in the very first section, the past is retention. It is what it is only by virtue of its connection to the present present, to the lived present. And the same with the future, which is not future as such, but expectation, anticipation. And that is, again, only what it is by its connection to the lived present. So we are trapped in the present with this, at this level of the primary habit, passive synthesis. So that's the first point. So he's talking about all these successive presents, that being contemporaneous with a third present. And all we're doing is orienting ourselves in light of this restriction that we have, where it's only the present, where we don't have recourse to a past or a future. The passive synthesis only has the present to operate with. And I guess one way to think about this is to think about maybe playing an instrument. If you play the guitar, for instance, when you're playing, you're in the present. You have this present, present, the lived present, but all of the skills that are in your fingers are a result of past presence, and they haven't disappeared. It's not that they don't exist anymore, but they are they feed into this present through my current activity. And so they have a kind of closer connection with this lived present than, say, if I were to try and remember where I put my keys yesterday, which is an act that would throw me right back into the past. When I think about where my keys were, I'm thinking about the past. I'm thinking about what I was doing yesterday. When I came home, where did I put my keys? I'm thinking about that past event. And it's a very different operation from playing the guitar and having my past practice sessions kind of carry forward into this lived present. So I think maybe that's one way to understand this, is that even though, so the past of my present, I can reflect on my past practice sessions, but that's not what I'm doing when I'm playing the guitar. Yet those past presents are still, they're manifesting, if you like, in my present, but not as past. They're manifesting through this lived present. That's kind of the way I think about it anyway. There's this tighter connection between past presence understood through the passive syntheses than there is between a genuine past understood through memory, which is an active synthesis. So that's why we're talking about all these different presents. And he goes on to say that the duration of this present depends on the natural contractile range, which is, I think, if you think about your experience, you have a present. You're living in your present now. That now, that sense of this is now, that is your natural contractile range. And that it covers, a number of different individual moments. We can break those down, but maybe you don't experience every single one of them. You are contracting a certain number of moments into what is your current present, your current now. And that limit, the amount that you can contract, the number of instants that you can contract, is your natural contractile range. And it's going to be similar for all of us. We should all have a similar natural contractile range because we're all human beings. We've all evolved the same processes. We all have similar bodies, and we perceive in similar ways. But that sense of this is now, the present is this, what's happening to me right now, that is this natural contractile range. And like I said, that now will vary. Well, I didn't say this actually, but that now varies according to species. So it's possible to imagine, and it could even be it's quite conceivably true that the present for a different species will be different from the now as we experience it. What's it like to be a bat, right? So there's going to be it's almost inevitable, I think. It's almost certain, even though we can't actually verify it, but it's almost certain that there will be a difference in that natural contractile range. The now, as we see it, is going to be different. And think about a tree, which might live for hundreds of years. Now is going to be a very different idea, even though obviously a tree's not conscious, but not conscious in the sense, not reflective like us, but that's what we're talking about, organic life. So even a tree would have this sense of there are passive syntheses going on which make up the tree. Therefore, there is a present for the tree, and that now the natural contractile range for it, because it lives so much longer than us, things happen so much more slowly. It's going to be probably longer. It's going to have a longer contractile range than we do. Again, none of this means the trees are thinking, right? There's no leap to this kind of new age type spirituality, everything's alive or everything's thinking, or we're part of some giant organic mind that's the universe or anything like that. Those to me are empty assertions. But this idea that there is a natural contractile range for different species, that makes perfect sense to me. And even, Deleuze says, different individuals, different organisms, there can be a difference in this. And perhaps that's true within I would say, a certain, within certain parameters, but it makes sense that there could be just a different sense of the present. And it might even, we could even go further than Deleuze here and say it's going to be different for the same individual at different moments of their lives, because we're all familiar with the way that time seems to crawl by when you're doing something you don't like, or it races by when you're doing something that you really enjoy. That the now that you experience will vary, but again, there is a natural contractile range within which I think we can say your now will oscillate, if it does. And he goes further again to say that this applies to parts of organisms, because again we're dealing with the passive syntheses that constitute all organic life. Your heart, your muscles, your the body itself, all of these things have this rudimentary present, this lived present, and it's it's restricted by this natural contractile range. Okay, so that's basically what that passage is. The present in this natural contractile range, and that gives us this. Fatigue marks the point at which the soul can no longer contract what it contemplates, the moment at which contemplation and contraction come apart. We are made up of fatigues as much as of contemplations. So the point of fatigue then is the point at which this contractile power stops working, the point at which this contractile power ends. And the way to think about it is the point at which this power becomes fatigued, no longer functions, no longer has the capacity to contract these moments together into a whole, into the organism that it is. So that these points beyond which I can't contract into a now, into my present, that's what Deleuze is talking about with the word fatigue. That's when my power to contract, my contemplative power, becomes fatigued. I really like that, actually. That's a really interesting idea. Therefore, we have said that we are literally made up of contemplations, contractions. But since there's a limit to this contractile range, we are also made up of, i.e. constituted by, our fatigues, just as much as we are by what we are able to contemplate, by what we are able to contract. And that, I think, is a really interesting and a deep insight. And we could even call this metaphysical fatigue, I think. And I'm very much reminded here of Levinas again, surprisingly enough, who talks about the effort involved of existing, the effort in existence, and that implying this notion of fatigue. Very, very different from what we're talking about here, of course, but still there is this connection. So, like I said, a surprising connection that pops up every now and then between Deleuze and Levinas. And also Bergson. Bergson's very prominent here because he talks about the effort of the tension. He calls it the tension. It's one of the two tendencies of the élan vital, to the tendency to contract, which is a tensing, versus the tendency to relax, which is a decontraction, detensing, detension. And all kind of feeding into Deleuze. It's really interesting how he takes up, you see little bits of different philosophers taken up by Deleuze and just worked in different ways, though, which is one of the reasons why I think he's just such a fascinating philosopher to think about. The other part of this section is need, and this should be quite short. We're just usually need is understood as lack. We're missing something. But this is understood from the point of view of action and the active syntheses, i.e. reflection. So when we say need, we generally mean we lack something, we're missing something, we need something. But Deleuze flips this on its head and says it's better understood, or perhaps more originarily understood, from the point of view of the passive synthesis, where it appears as extreme satiety. We're completely full. We've exhausted our contractile powers. We've contracted everything that we can. So we have this extreme satiety where it's fully positive here, as opposed to the negative connotations that the active synthesis gives us of need. where what we need here then with fatigue is we need something outside of what we've already contracted. So our need then draws not from what we are, from not the sense that we're missing something, but from the sense that we are completely full. We're completely sated. We have no more scope, no more capacity to take on anymore. So it's a fully positive source of need. Once we've fully contracted everything we can, we need to expand, to extend, to take on some, we need to move in a sense in it further, to take on some other things. We need to change something but the point is that the need is motivated by a positivity, a complete satiety, as opposed to the need of the active syntheses, which arises from a lack, a feeling of a negative sense. And that's very, and again, that's Levinas. He talks about metaphysical desire. And this metaphysical desire, he says, is not a lack. It doesn't arise from the sense that we're missing something. It's not negative. It's a fully positive, kind of attractive force. And again, taken up and used by Deleuze in a different way, but it has there is this resonance with Levinas. And this is the theme in Deleuze, that avoiding negation, not wanting to understand reality, metaphysical reality in negative terms, because negation is not originary. It's not metaphysical. Negation comes on top of that. Negation is an addition to what is originally a pure positivity. And that's very Bergsonian, because he says exactly the same thing. Negation is not original. It's not, in a metaphysical sense of the word, it's not, there is no sense in which the word negative has any genuine metaphysical meaning. The meaning is, the meaning of the negative comes from the act from an intellectual act, from thinking about it, which is that it comes from the active syntheses. So it comes afterwards. If we want to talk about metaphysics, the negative can have no role in that, and that's something we've already seen with Deleuze, and like I say, it's a theme, I think, that we can say circles back around for Deleuze as the book goes on. Okay, I'm starting to babble. That means I've spent too long on this. Let's bring this to an end with a summary. All right, so first we looked at repetition. Two kinds of repetition. There was repetition in the object. This is a passive synthesis. The operative force here was imagination, but not that kind of imagination. Then the other kind of repetition was repetition in the subject. This was an active synthesis. And the operative forces here are memory and intelligence. Then we looked at habit. And again, two kinds of habits for Deleuze. Sensory motor, which is psychological and involves the active syntheses. And primary, which is our habit of living. And this concerns the passive syntheses. And this is, so this was again organic, prior to sensing, prior to perception, prior to thought, prior to reflection. So when he talks about contemplation, we're not talking about, again, like with imagination, not that kind of contemplation. Contemplation is the contraction which constitutes the thing itself. So it's organic. It's how the subject comes to be. Then we looked at the self, and the way that the self is the difference drawn from repetition, drawn from the passive syntheses, the repetition in the passive syntheses. And we also looked at the selves as larval subjects, so not full subjects, but still selves, in the sense that there is still contraction going on and there's still difference being drawn from those contractions. So organisms are made up of many little selves, as Deleuze calls them, but like we talked about, not as a kind of combination of little selves. The self which you are is a completely different kind of or arises from a completely different kind of operation than that of the little selves of which you are comprised. So difference can be drawn from repetition in two ways. The first was lengthwise, and this is a difference between the passive and the active syntheses or repetitions, and in depth, and this was difference between the contractions within the passive syntheses themselves. Then we looked at fatigue and the way that this refers to the edges, the limits of our contractile range, of what we can contract into a present, into a lived present. And noted that we're made up of fatigues just as much as we're made up of contemplations. And finally, we looked at need as extreme satiety. So the point here being that need does not arise from a lack. That's how need appears when you look at it through the lens of the active syntheses. Rather, it arises from full positivity, from extreme satiety, and that's understood at the level of passive syntheses, which again, because it's more originary, that's more foundational, that's why Deleuze is saying that its need is better understood at that level. And there were three main ideas that I really wanted to pull out from today's video, and they all concern primary habit. The first is that contemplation is the contraction which constitutes the thing itself. For example, the heart, the muscles, the organism itself, the body. Contemplation is that contraction, and that contraction gives rise to the thing. That's what makes this metaphysical. It's not the act of a mind. This contemplation gives rise to the thing that will be the subject, that will become a subject. The second idea was that what repeats is the habit of contraction itself, i.e. not individual elements, not individual moments, not individual actions, as it was for Hume and Bergson, where the individual elements are what is repeated. For Deleuze, what's repeated is the very act of contraction itself. So, this is how difference appears in the contractions. The difference, the repetitions are never identical, because they're completely different acts of contraction. What's the same, and what means that Deleuze can call this repetition, is that the act of contracting is being repeated. So that was the second main idea, I think. And the final idea that I wanted to emphasize is that difference in the primary habit lies between two repetitions. So difference is drawn from two repetitions, two of these contracting actions, two of these contracting powers, which constitute the thing itself. Okay, and that's us for today. yeah, that video turned out to be much longer than I anticipated. But I think there's some good stuff in there. I think it's only like 10 pages in the book. That's what worries me. How long is this video series going to be? But hopefully we can get through the rest of it a little bit more smoothly. But anyway, I think it was important to really hammer out some of these ideas, because they are quite original. And if we don't have a clear understanding of this now, the rest of this chapter is just going to be indecipherable completely. So hopefully that helps in some way. Thanks for watching, as always, and we'll catch you in the next one.